Next section, free blacks, slaves without masters. So this section's talking about African Americans who are not slaves, how they are treated. So first we'll talk about the South, how free blacks kind of lived in the South. So by 1860, so right before the Civil War, there were about 250,000 free blacks in the South. Many of those free blacks had ancestors that had been freed during that kind of revolutionary idealism that happened right after the Revolution. So a lot of these were ancestors of those slaves that were freed after the Revolution, or some of these were the mulattoes, right? They had a dad who was white, a mom who was black, oftentimes that being the product of a white slave owner taking advantage of maybe like a black slave. So some of those free blacks were the children of white slave owners. And some of them actually had earned their freedom. So after they were done working, maybe at night, they would work other places, making money. After a while, they earned enough money to buy or purchase their own freedom. And many in the South, they owned property. Some even owned slaves. So we're talking about free blacks here. So some owned property, some even owned slaves. And they're kind of considered as almost like a third race. They weren't white, they weren't black, they're kind of in the middle. They couldn't work certain jobs, they couldn't testify against whites in court. There's always the threat of kind of being kidnapped or hijacked back into slavery. And a lot of, especially in the South, a lot of whites really resented the free blacks because they were kind of an example of what might be if slavery was abolished. So, they're considering slaves to be property, but then they see these free blacks kind of in their face, and they resented that. So in the North, we have about 250,000 free blacks as well. And, they were definitely discriminated against in the North also. The free blacks couldn't vote. They couldn't attend any of the public schools. Of course, our friends, the Irish, hated them because they saw the free blacks as a competition for unskilled labor jobs. Sometimes really the anti-black feeling, if you will, was sometimes actually stronger in the North than in the South. Former slave Frederick Douglass, who we will be talking about here in a little bit, he was beaten by crowds in the North. Because the South was, some people in the South were actually raised by black women, black slaves. They were actually raised by them. They knew the blacks personally. I hate calling them the blacks, but just for reference, they knew them personally. So it was kind of weird because the North kind of liked the race, but really despised the individual. And the South really, was kind of the opposite. They liked the individual, but despised the race, if that makes sense. Because the South, they really knew the slaves one-to-one. And in the North, while there was the idea of, liking the race, they despised the individual when they met them. Anyway, next section, Plantation Slavery. Okay, so by 1860, like I said, right before the Civil War, there were over 4 million slaves. And this number is, of course, way up than it had been pretty much at any time because this kind of cotton boom really reinvigorated, I can never say that word, but really brought to life again slavery. So the importation of slaves actually ended officially in America in 1808. So Congress ended the importation of slaves. So those slave ships, they weren't coming to America anymore. In 1807, Britain also ended the slave trade. In fact, there was a part of the British Royal Navy called the West African Squadron, and what they would do is they over the course of time they seized hundreds of slave ships full of enslaved Africans, and freed thousands of these newly enslaved people. And what else did we talk about? Yeah, so importation of slaves after 1808 was illegal. In fact, on the books, you could get the death penalty for smuggling in slaves. But still, slaves were smuggled in by the thousands into the South. I think your book mentioned that a lot of times, even if a slave trader was caught smuggling in slaves, the courts would more or less, acquit them or dismiss that charge. In fact, only one slave trader was actually ever killed, and that was, or executed, and that was in the North during the Civil War. So while on the books it said, we stopped the importation of slavery in 1808, there were still thousands that are being smuggled in. But in the most part, really, this increase in slavery, or this increase in the number of slaves, really came around through natural reproduction. Remember, slaves were really seen as an investment. They were expensive, $1,200 for a slave. So slaves were often kind of spared the most dangerous work. So kind of, roofing the house, or draining a swamp, or blasting a new tunnel. A lot of times the slaves were exempt from this very dangerous work because the slave owners wanted to protect their investment. They'd much rather, hire some Irishmen and have the Irishmen break their necks rather than lose their investment in their slaves. So the Deep South really held the most slaves at this time. So over half of all the slaves in the South were held in these 5 states that were called the Deep South. Okay, South Carolina, Florida, Mississippi, Alabama, Louisiana, the Deep South. That's where about half of the slaves really lived. And a lot of the slaves that were born and raised in the northern part or the upper part of the South, a lot of times were kind of like sucked down south, or a lot of the slaves that were born naturally, whatever, were sucked kind of down south, sold downriver, because that's really where the heart of slavery really was. Some slaves, wanting to promote the natural increase in slavery, would promise freedom to any slave woman who had 10 or more children. If a woman had 13 or 14 kids, they were considered, just wonderful breeders. Isn't that a horrible, degrading term? Slave auctions were just horrifying events. A lot of times a slave auction would divide family members. Slaves were sold in auctions right along with horses and cows. Just very horrifying. And this whole idea of breaking apart the family, having, the dad sold off to, a plantation downriver, the kids go in one place, mom go in another place. It was just horrifying. A book, books that's really brings this issue to life is Uncle Tom's Cabin. Really kind of decried the practice of breaking up families through these slave auctions. And this novel was written by Harriet Beecher Stowe, and she was just like a house mom. But really, this book, well written or not, there's debates like, it's not really good literature. Regardless, it really made a big impact, and we'll talk about that a little bit like later on in American history. But Uncle Tom's Cabin was really put forth, or just really brought to light how horrible these slaves auctions were, and the breaking apart of the families. And really, though, most of, in the Deep South, most of the families, which we'll talk about later, their lives were very stable. The slaves' families were stable. There wasn't a lot of breaking apart of slaves' families in the South, the Deep South, but it's usually in the upper North where you would see a lot of these slave auctions. The upper North. The upper South, where you'll see a lot of these slave auctions, a lot of breaking apart of families. The next section, life under the lash. Lash meaning the whip. All right, so in the white Southerners' idea, a black slave was kind of, happy, singing, dancing, banjo playing person, harkening back to the minstrel shows showing these kind of happy-go-lucky slaves. But really, conditions of slaves themselves vary very greatly. They really varied. But regardless, regardless of how or where you lived and worked, slavery, you had a lot of hard work and you had a lot of oppression. You worked from dawn till dusk, yeah, and you had very, very little legal protection. There were some regulations against just, the arbitrary murder of your slaves, and there were some regulations against, unusually cruel punishment. Some states even went so far as to banning the sale of children under 10 away from their mothers. But really, even these regulations were in place, they were really hard to enforce, especially since, blacks couldn't testify in court. There were some folks called breakers, and these were slave drivers who would use the whip to break the soul of strong-willed slaves. So to keep kind of the slaves in line, there were some called breakers or slave drivers that would really just kind of break the will of the really strong-willed slaves through the use of beating them with a whip. Still, it was relatively uncommon to see a lot of this really brutal beating of slaves. Because, whip marks really hurt the resale value of a slave. And, slaves were really seen as an investment. So while we do see these horrific photographs of slaves just with scars up and down their back being beaten, and while that did happen, really it was relatively uncommon, just because they really did see the slaves as an investment. But the overseer and his whip were kind of just a part of this system, because there's no wage incentive, meaning, the slaves aren't working for their paycheck, right? There's no really incentive for them to work. So, the overseer with the whip was a part of the system, even though brutal beatings weren't super common. All right, so like I said before, kind of in the deep south, itself, there was an area called the Black Belt. And the Black Belt, not surprisingly, was the area in the Deep South with the highest concentration of slaves. And oftentimes, this was newly expanded land. So, slaves that were in more the established states, the states have been around for a while, had it a little bit easier than the slaves kind of in this Black Belt, because it's just a lot harder work. On the frontier, you are clearing new land. There's, just like the frontier in the north, there's less civilization around. It's just a harder life. So it's the same thing with the slaves, kind of in this newly expanding land. It was a lot harder there than the more settled areas kind of the Old South. Okay, so let's talk about slavery in this Black Belt. Like I said before, slaves in the north, or in the upper south I should say, a lot of times their families would be broken apart, and then some of their family would be kind of sold downriver to this Black Belt. But once you were in the Black Belt, once you were in kind of the deep south, family life of the slaves was relatively stable. Okay, and there's kind of a unique slave culture that was allowed to develop because of that. Most slaves lived in the Deep South, lived on plantations that had at least 20 other slaves, so you really can kind of see a community forming. But still, in their wedding vows, they would always vow till death or distance to us part. So they weren't completely exempt from getting broken up, but really a lot of slaves were raised in this stable two-family homes. So although life as a slave wasn't excellent, the kind of stability was there a little bit. A lot of times you would see slaves named after their grandparents, showing the fact that there was definitely kind of a family lineage that was able to form. And we saw a lot of kind of roots or African roots kind of taking hold in this new kind of slave culture. One of the roots we see is the fact that the slaves wouldn't marry their first cousins. But you're like, what? Well, in the South, the whites at this time often would marry their first cousins. But the fact that the slaves wouldn't do that kind of show a reflection of life back in Africa. Their religion was a mixture of Christianity and African elements. Their Christianity often emphasized things like the captivity of the Israelites in Egypt. They're often hearkening back to that. Also, another kind of root we see of the African culture is their style of preaching. So remember the Christian church? It's called responsorial. So, when the minister's up there preaching his heart out, the congregation would add like, amen, or, preach it, brother, whatever you have. But this kind of responsorial aspect of the congregation really harkened back to something they called ring shout dancing in Africa, which is kind of a give and take between the caller and the dancers. So even in this responsorial type of preaching, we see some African roots. All right. Next section, the burdens of bondage. So obviously slavery was very degrading. You were denied education. In fact, by the Civil War, 9/10 of all slaves couldn't read at all, read or write, so they're illiterate. And slaves fought against the slave system the best they could. There were, oftentimes they would work at a very slow pace, kind of the barest minimum, going the barest minimum to avoid getting whipped. And that kind of brought about the idea or the myth of black laziness because the slaves would work so slowly. They would often pilfer or steal food and other kind of household goods from the big house, from the slave owner's house. They would often break machinery on purpose, kind of stopping production. Oh, I guess the reaper's broken. We can't do any work today. Sometimes they would run away, most of the times looking for lost family members. Sometimes they poisoned their master's food, although that was relatively uncommon. There were a number of slave rebellions, but they were very unsuccessful. Things didn't really work out well for the slaves that tried to rebel. In 1800, there's a slave whose name is Gabriel in Richmond, Virginia. He was trying to organize a slave rebellion, but there were some informers that ruined his plans, and he was hung. Similarly, we have Denmark Vesey, who we talked about earlier in American history. He was a free black in Charleston, South Carolina, and he was trying to organize a slave rebellion. But once again, there were some informers, they were found out, and over 30 of those leaders were hung. Kind of new to this chapter, we have Nat Turner's rebellion. So Nat Turner's rebellion happened in 1831. Nat Turner was a black preacher, and he organized a slave revolt in Virginia that actually resulted in the death of 60 whites, a lot of them being women and children. He was, that was fiercely put down. That was put down fairly quickly, but it really caused a lot of fear in the South. The Southerners were really scared that something like Nat Turner's rebellion might happen again. So although Nat Turner and his rebellion, it was unsuccessful, it was definitely squashed. That fear started to kind of creep in to the Southern families, thinking this could happen again. Okay. So kind of the section ends off with a kind of a interesting happening at this time. So in 1839, there was this Spanish slave ship. So it's a ship with a bunch of newly enslaved Africans that were, owned, anyway, a Spanish slave ship. And it was called the Amistad. Okay? And what happened is the newly enslaved Africans actually rebelled and were able to overtake the slave ship. And on their attempts to kind of get back to Africa, they were trying to sail back to Africa, they they were driven ashore in Long Island. So now we have a bunch of newly enslaved Africans on a ship, but they're free, and we're like, well, what do we do with them? So they were put in prison, and it took about 2 years and several trials before they were finally allowed to return back to Africa. And the person kind of behind this, the effort to let these enslaved Africans return, was our friend, former President John Quincy Adams. John Quincy Adams now is in the Congress, and he worked tirelessly for 2 years to really free the newly enslaved Africans that were on the Spanish slave ship, the Amistad. All right, I think that is enough for this video.